York. Open New York is a pro-housing activist group that advocates for more housing, both market rate and affordable, in particular in high opportunity, whiter, wealthier neighborhoods of New York City, as well as policy reforms at both the city and the state level that could facilitate housing growth. This is things like legalizing ADUs, potentially comprehensive planning, all topics that we'll get to further down the line. And so with that, I have the immense pleasure of introducing Kathryn Garcia, who's been a leader in city government for many years, had a leadership role at DEP, making sure that the city's water was safe and clean to drink. She also served as the sanitation commissioner, the acting NYCHA chair, city's lead czar, and served as the COVID-19 emergency food czar, all of which is to say she knows the city's operations, neighborhoods, and policies inside and out. So Kathryn, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. Yes, I've gotten to go to Queens and find out that the streets in Brooklyn that are one way and that wide are two way. And I'm like, how do we get spreaders? Like, how does this work? Who's going first? But I'm running for mayor because I love this city. I love all of its neighborhood and its idiosyncratic challenges. And I grew up here with my 4 siblings in a multiracial family. I don't know how my parents did it, to be quite honest with you, because at one point there were 3 of us under 3. And there was a lot of hanging out in the street. We used to be told not to come home before dinner time. There were no screens back in the day. And I chose to raise my children here. And I think New York is a fabulous place to live, but it is a hard place to live, particularly when you're talking about housing and the cost of housing in the city. And we want to make sure that everyone has the opportunity to have a safe, healthy place to live. I think that that's critical. And we make building housing nearly impossible. There was actually recently an article comparing Jersey City to New York City in terms of number of units built. And I was like, wow, we look really bad. They're like, oh, we did a 10,000 unit and then we did 5,000. And this is all within the past year or so. But we have to have a strong recovery. And that will be about getting the virus under control, but also rebuilding the things that are special about New York, rebuilding our cultural industry, rebuilding our hospitality industry. I know that someday I hope to actually celebrate things again and be able to toast. I'm like, oh my goodness, it's New Year's. What am I doing? Oh, nothing. I'm doing nothing. At least it keeps your weight down during the holiday season to have no parties to go to. But in order to really build back, we have to have excellent public services. We have to make sure that people feel safe in their communities. We have to make sure that the city is clean. Hopefully kids will go to school at some point, but we need to be doing that through a lens as we rebuild on climate change and making sure that we are both resilient and contributing to reducing our greenhouse gases. And as Casey mentioned, I have been the go-to crisis manager, and we have to approach housing as a crisis. We've been talking about the challenges of housing in New York City, I think, since the end of World War II, without a particular sense of urgency. We have New Yorkers sleeping on the street. We can't wait another day for more affordable housing. And I am willing to focus our limited resources on units that are less than 30% of AMI. So not on the higher levels, but really on deeply affordable housing, but also make it easier, faster for private partners to build. In construction, time is always money. And to the extent that we can make it so that it is faster, we will get more buildings built. We will get more people into housing. And I do think that COVID offers us an opportunity to do some conversions of either hotels that really no longer make financial sense and convert them into real apartments, or office space that no longer makes sense if the floor plate works, like what happened in Lower Manhattan. And they've done better than Midtown because they are a 24/7 neighborhood now. But we also need to be creative, end the zoning that blocks us from really creating more density, legalize basement apartments, make it so that we can have single room occupancy again in a way that's safe. because there are approximately a third of the households that are single adult households in the city of New York, and accelerate all of the approvals. This might be also because I lived on the side of someone who tried to build things. And as I've said to others, you should definitely say you want to build a sanitation garage, because then they will let you build anything else. But getting through ULURP and getting through the design and construction is just painful. And finally, we really need to make sure that NYCHA is working for its nearly 400,000 residents or more, depending on where their population survey is. You're talking about a population the size of Miami. And this is a real public good. I think of it as infrastructure. In the same way you think of a bridge, we should think about NYCHA as infrastructure for the city of New York. But it doesn't need a new plan. It needs to execute on any of the plans that it has and get money into those apartments as soon as humanly possible, so that you can give them new kitchens and bathrooms, and goodness, make it so that the elevators actually ever work. It's astonishing. Like, I was there actually delivering food at Baruch houses, and we're bringing boxes and boxes of food into the building. And of course, the elevator goes up, then it goes down, and we're on the wrong floor, or we've already given to this floor. That's not normal. It should not be normal, except that it is. And so I'm running to make it so that people in the city of New York actually have a better life and feel like they have access to economic opportunity. But in order to have anyone feel that they can do more, they need to know that they're housed. Meaning, housing is healing. We know that COVID spread, not necessarily because of density, we talk of it as density, but because of overcrowding. People couldn't quarantine from each other, and whole families got sick. And many of particularly the seniors of the family, multi-generational, died. And we will have to live with that and deal with that over time. But that is just one of the things, is we need more housing. So I am very excited to be here and happy to answer any questions. And hope that 2021 is a far better year than 2020 has been.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And again, very, very happy and excited to have you here and talking with us. So you covered a lot of ground right there already, but I do want to kind of highlight what I believe is at the top of the housing policy page on your website, which is that you've set a pretty ambitious goal of 50,000 units at 30% AMI or below. And I'd love to just dig in kind of and start with, how does that happen? Where are those units coming from? Where's the subsidy coming from? And where are the units going to go?
So I do think that we need to make sure that we are evenly distributing those units across the city, but primarily in places that have strong transit and enough schools to be able to have families live there, and that there are jobs available. Like, we want to prioritize places that people live, that they have strong neighborhoods to live in. But it needs to be across the city. And I think one of the ways that we have to deal with that is to prioritize their approvals as we move through any of the bureaucracy, whether or not they need a rezoning, or if they need just basic building permits or demo permits to get started. All of those things take a lot of time, but it does mean you're prioritizing the subsidy to, you're prioritizing the lowest income over volume. And so that is what I am planning to do.
Wonderful. So you mentioned some broad strokes there of places where there are jobs, places where there are schools, and I do want to push you on this a little bit, because that's what we do at Open New York. Is we're on the ground. We're at the community boards, or we're at DCP hearings, or all of these places where sites really get worked up. So in particular, kind of at the neighborhood level, if there are rezonings that would be necessary to produce this housing, are there particular neighborhoods, particular rezonings that you would propose as mayor?
I have not looked specifically at all the neighborhoods, but I'm certainly supportive of the Soho NoHo rezoning, as well as the Gowanus rezoning. I think those are two areas that will be able to, particularly the Gowanus, will be able to have a density to it that will be able to create an enormous number of units.
Great. Well, glad to hear it. We've been hard at work on those two, and fingers crossed will be completed by the time you or anyone else takes office. But appreciate that. So kind of continuing on that track, part of you referenced bureaucracy, and we'll get into permits and that sort of thing a little later on. But a large part of the, I don't want to say the unnecessary delay, but a large part of the process for something getting approved is community input. And we've seen this both in, ongoing ULURPs, plus on the kind of homelessness side of housing and homelessness. It's especially been highlighted recently with the saga at the Lucerne and other hotels around the city, but it's kind of an ongoing question with shelters and supportive housing as well, is local opposition. And, depending on your viewpoint, some of it is more worthy than others. Some of it is people who are legitimately concerned about gentrification or being priced out and displacement. Some of it is racist and classist and other things that we would prefer not to see in in our city that we love. And so very broadly, how do you think about community input, and how do you think about, in particular, the small but vocal contingent of folks who are fighting against the sorts of things that you've just said? And I think broadly people agree, we need a lot more housing, we need supportive services. How do you think about how to weigh community input against a citywide need for housing and shelters and supportive housing and services?
I think that you weigh the community should have input. I mean, you should always be listening, but I don't think they should drive the entire conversation because, and I also actually think we should pick who's going to be in those affordable housing units because they have no advocates. There's not a face and a family to stand up and say, you're blocking my home from being built. And it needs to have a face and a name because it is about people. Those are people who will live in that building. And I think that being able to advocate from a human point of view is much more important than when you say, oh, we're building a lot of units. It just doesn't feel like anything important or that it's going to matter or it can go somewhere else. But I almost think that you need to think about doing like a citywide zoning that says everybody's going to take some of this. Doesn't matter. Everybody's going to take some because you all need housing. And it actually, I think one of the things we'll find coming out of COVID is what we've seen so far recently is that prices have been coming down in places that have a lot of building. They're not cheap yet, but they're down. So I don't want to suggest that they're low income housing, but they're down. And I think that will make New York more affordable. So I think we need to make sure that we are advocating from a position of strength around affordable housing and supportive housing. And the more that you can put, this is the family. It's, the Smiths, their 3 kids are moving into this apartment. So you're going to stand there at a community meeting and say, you don't want them. It's a lot harder to fight the little kid than it is to fight just its units or something, or it's going to cause a problem. And also, like, I've lived in New York City my entire life. New York City changes, and that's okay. Like, we redevelop each other and ourselves and regenerate. And I know occasionally we go through the every other store as a nail salon, but then it changes again. And we need to be open to that happening because then we can serve all of the diverse communities, which is what we love in the city of New York.
Great. So you referenced then, every neighborhood, every district needs to develop housing, which I think for folks who've been talking about comprehensive planning, that is ringing a lot of bells. So as you've probably seen, the city council and Speaker Johnson put forward a report and are introducing a bill to create a comprehensive planning process. It's still very much being shaped. The bill hasn't passed the city council yet. And even if it does, there'll be, probably a decade of figuring out the details before it goes into effect. But at a very high level, is that something you support? And then kind of from there, what sort of details would you like to see as part of a citywide approach to housing? And in particular on this kind of district by district question, whether it's city council districts, community districts, any other measure, would you support hard targets, whether for affordable housing or for total units at a district level?
So I would definitely support targets at a district level, whatever the geography is we come up with. I like community boards because I have lived in sanitation and we were coterminous with community boards, so I know exactly where those are. I'm not as good at council district lines, partly because I live on an edge, so I move every census. But the only thing I would be cautious about in terms of the master planning is that we don't stop doing what we need to do, waiting for a plan. And I don't want the perfect to be the enemy of the good. We need things to be happening right now, and not in 5 years or 10 years. And also that we don't just create like, a consultant world who all get paid really well and don't really help us get to the place we need to be.
Cool. Well, that is absolutely right. And now I think we'll want to get into we don't want to wait 10 years for anything. So you know buildings inside and out, city bureaucracy inside and out. And I want to start actually aside from ULURP. So setting ULURP aside for a minute. What other reforms would you make to speed these sorts of approvals along? Whether that's DOB, DCP, any other of the many departments in the
services
city.
If you're building on the waterfront.
Exactly.
So there are a couple of things that I would do. One is there need to be strict timelines for DOB review, and it has to be public where you are in the process. Like, is it received? Is it under review? Have you received comments back? All of that can happen electronically where someone could log in and see it. Because I often find when I've done buildings is even as an agency head, plans go in. I actually needed an expediter. I was a fellow commissioner. I needed an expediter. Infuriated me. So the city of New York had to pay an expediter to get another city agency to do permits. So that you're really seeing the whole entire process as it moves through. And allowing the self-certification process to be broader, but also holding engineers and architects accountable when they screw up. Like, if they put that they're doing a sewer connection to X sewer, and if you had looked at the maps, you'd know there isn't a sewer there, that's bad engineering. To allow more of that to happen and to allow them to really push the envelope, I think would be extremely helpful. On the fire department, which I don't know how many of you have ever dealt with the fire department, if you submitted plans that were approved and you built to those plans, they have to approve the build. What often happens is they come in and they're like, oh, I'd like 6 more sprinkler heads on that system. Oh, I'd like your system to have a heater in it. It's too close to the door. If we approve the plans, we inspect, it's to plan, then we should just move on, rather than the back and forth. But there's also, we make everyone carry their plans from agency to agency. You should have almost like a project manager who's guiding you through. Do you need a permit from here or there? There's a way to do it that's so much more seamless for the owner or the rep to get it done, and being able to see that in a workflow and hold people accountable. What was your turnaround time? Why are you at 30 days? Why are you at 60 days? This shouldn't be true.
Great. Absolutely. I would love to see more transparency and open data there. So we set it aside last time, but then to ULURP specifically, are there changes that you would make to ULURP? And if so, what are they?
So, obviously there are some things I can do on ULURP. There are some things I can't do on ULURP. But one of the things I think we need to do is there are all these sequential steps on getting input that could all happen at the same time. And then there's the summer break. Like, we can't move anything during July or August. We need to actually be a functioning city for all seasons. And you got to get your information in. There are plenty of opportunities, but a lot of these timeframes could be reduced You know, it's still arduous, but it could be significantly reduced. And I think we need to go back and look at the EIS and the EAS process, because those are also your year to 18 months before you even can get into ULURP.
And when you say we have to go back and look at them, is that changing the sorts of things that they need to consider? Is that changing when in the process they're written and approved? What does that look like?
Right. It's both when they are written and approved, but also exactly what information do you need and how current does it have to be? And because oh, this is getting a little in the weeds, but you can only take traffic counts at certain points in the year. You know, you can only, and then that feeds into the big modeling system to spit out your air issues, your traffic issues. But if you don't make it into ULURP in a timely fashion, you got to redo the whole thing. And is it really going to be that different? Like, as long as you're not talking, it's 10 years ago. But it also is like you're asking something to predict more than it should be asked to predict, because no one could have predicted COVID and what that's doing to the traffic and what's happening. So, and traffic tends to drive a lot of the other pieces of it. So we need to make sure that the infrastructure is in place, that we're not going to create harmful environmental, but we can make it so that it's a little more streamlined.
Great. So you mentioned COVID, and I want to then pivot to that a little bit. You know, it's beyond the human tragedy of the pandemic. At the city level, it's also cut a hole in our city budget, and likely will for another few years, even if, fingers crossed, the vaccine rollout goes well. The city budget is not, and state budget are probably not going to recover for a while. Without getting too far into it, the feasibility of borrowing, deficit spending at the city and the state level are much more limited than the federal government. So within that kind of smaller sum of money that's available, how would you balance housing budgets, whether that's specific affordable housing programs, capital budget, anything else, with other city needs, whether that's other departments, city services, that sort of thing?
So there are a couple of things I want to speak to here. One, you can't deficit spend for operating money. You can absolutely deficit spend for construction. And we should be maximizing a 0% interest rate environment. One, because it'll be cheaper for the city, but two, because you want to be counter-cyclical. You want to be building when the private sector isn't, to get people back to work. Because we need, in order for the city's revenues to come back, we need people to be back at work. So anything we can do to support work is very important. But the other thing is we are spending gargantuan amounts of money on shelters. Gargantuan. I think Steve Banks' budget's like $3 billion. It's some insane number at this point in time for not great shelters, miserable people, and financially difficult for the city. It would make more sense to give people a rent voucher than to have them living in a shelter, because it's way more expensive. So you need to look at the whole picture. But my approach would be, what are the investments that we need to make long term that are the right investments? Housing is clearly one of them. And what are we paying too much for right now that just costs us money and doesn't move us at all towards our goals? And then how you deal with the overall city budget. And I do think there will eventually be some money from the feds. It won't be enough. I know, are beginning to refinance all of our current debt. That's a very big portion. But we also need to sit down with labor and have some real genuine productivity conversations where they are given targets to jointly come up with savings plans that are able to still provide the services that New Yorkers need, but really drives down the costs of being able to provide those services.
So you mentioned vouchers, and I think you probably were referring to something slightly different, but just because it's a live issue at the moment. The city FEPS voucher amount, I'm sure you know that there's been kind of an ongoing question about raising the value of those so that they can pay for the rent in a greater variety of New York City neighborhoods. Is that something you support?
Yes, to it, as long as we're not saying we're giving them a $5,000 voucher, but yes, that there should be access more broadly, because it's often, not only is it just certain neighborhoods, there's not enough housing at that price point to allow people to use their vouchers. And if you get a voucher, we want you to be able to use it. We want you to find a home.
Yeah, absolutely. So then kind of staying with the affordable housing budget items and in particular at the city level, the Mayor de Blasio's kind of signature affordable housing program, MIH, has been somewhat controversial in terms of, for folks who don't know, although I'm guessing that folks who are on this call probably are very familiar with the ins and outs of MIH, but essentially as he's proposed rezonings of neighborhoods and rezonings of lots, has used a mechanism called inclusionary zoning to ensure that a certain percentage of them are deed restricted affordable at a certain percentage AMI. It's been, a mixed bag in terms of what it's produced. The city hasn't hit its targets from when it proposed the program. Is that something like MIH, something that you would keep in place? If so, what do you like about it and what would you change about it?
So, I think that MIH is the right idea, but I think we need to really look at how to implement it differently. The underlying piece of MIH is that the market rate apartments will support the subsidized apartments. And that is true in certain neighborhoods. That is not true in all. And if we want mixed income housing to be encouraged, you may need a different approach in places like East New York. They rezoned in 2016. They have 187 units. It's ridiculously small because the market doesn't support it. And we need to be clear-eyed about what the market supports and put our money where our mouth is to say, okay, if we may need to do higher subsidies here. They can't build us out of this. So in these areas, maybe that needs to be our focus. But again, it's about, land use, the ability to legalize ADUs, basement apartments, single family zoning in the city. You really want duplexes and triplexes. Well, I actually really like them because I like the idea of multi-generational housing, but not quite in the same house. I think that works better for all. But we need to be using all of our tools. And MIH, I think, was thought to be the wonder kid. And it just hasn't actually ended up being a wonder kid because it only actually financially works in certain areas.
Absolutely. So this is moving kind of to if you were in charge of every level of New York government, which of course the mayor isn't, but there are also plenty of affordable housing and budget questions at the state level as well that, even if the mayor doesn't have direct control over them, does have the bully pulpit, so to speak, to advocate for changes. A good portion of the state legislature does represent, at the very least, constituents in New York City. And so there's some weight there. And so I'm going to start with the big one, which is property taxes, property tax reform. It's been a question for decades now. There have been task forces and reports, and every New York City think tank has put out a proposal about how to fix it and what's wrong with it. So a two-part question here. First of all, in a perfect world, you could do whatever you wanted. How would you go about changing New York City property taxes? And then secondly, kind of pedal to the metal, what would your relationship be with policymakers at the state level to try to improve the current property tax situation in New York City?
Yeah, which is a great question. So I'm going to reach my hand out and touch that third rail. So if I had my druthers, which obviously I don't because the state will weigh in, the first thing you have to do is really create a broad-based coalition that represents a lot of interests and a lot of different neighborhoods, because it's going to require a huge political lift to make any change. And then I think what you need to do is base it off the market value. of the property and provide credits to people who are either by age or by length of tenure, so that there's no shock to those folks who might not be able to afford their brownstone and Bed-Stuy if suddenly they've lived there for 40 years and suddenly their assessment, which has been capped by the 6% forever, jumps mightily. Like, we don't want to have a shock to people who have been longtime dwellers of their neighborhood, but we need to make it so it's transparent. I mean, one of the things that's insane is nobody can figure out what their property taxes are. And if it's based off the market rate, you don't have to assess the whole market rate value. We could choose to assess less and live a little bit more frugally, shall I say. But we want to make sure that we put that in place to just make it more transparent. It's gotten so out of whack and weird. Like, why a co-op versus a condo? It's like, it's like, oh, your $30 million co-op is based off a multifamily rental calculation. Okay, that doesn't make any sense. I understand why they did it initially, but it's just gotten warped over time. And so going back and saying we're going to just sort of baseline everything and then just provide deep enough credits for those who could be in for a surprising shock, because you don't want to destabilize neighborhoods going forward. But it would be a huge political lift. It will require a very large coalition to put it together. But I have to say that if you use the data that is available and start to show what it really means and how discriminatory it is across different neighborhoods, it becomes hard for people to say, well, it's just fair for me. When they see that it clearly means it's unfair to somebody else.
Great. And so just to kind of follow up on that point about some protection so that neighborhoods don't completely turn over, does that mean you'd support something like a circuit breaker?
Yeah, that you wouldn't do something that, oh goodness, everyone who's lived there for 40 years suddenly can't afford to live there. That would be insane and actually shouldn't pass. But you want to make it so that it's transparent. And I think you can. It will just be a very big political lift and will require a very large coalition of different stakeholders. Absolutely. And a lot of work with Albany, because you would need their help.
Yeah, so I now want to follow up on exactly that point, which is Albany. The property tax reform would go through the legislature, but there's also this ongoing question of the relationship between the governor and the mayor. I think the relationship between the governor and our current mayor is pretty well documented. How would you work with Governor Cuomo, who, were you elected, you'd have at least a couple of years of overlap, assuming he stays in his current term?
So I have worked very well with the state agencies who usually regulate me, whether or not I was at DEP or at sanitation. They're pretty strong environmental laws on the books that you must comply with. But worked incredibly well with folks at DEC over the years. As we used to say, the parents fight and the children get along. And I think that is my approach, but it's not only working with the governor. You need to really incorporate the thinking of the state elected officials, the local state elected officials. We don't talk to them enough about what's happening in the neighborhoods. And, City Hall tends to cater to the council, but in some ways, the Senate and the Assembly have a lot more control over our daily lives than people fully understand. And creating a really balanced relationship with them, I think, is incredibly important.
Absolutely. So then just to kind of throw a grab bag of topics into one on the state legislature, there's been a bunch of movement recently on housing that affects New York City, whether that's tenant protections, the eviction moratorium that went into effect this year, other tax programs. I mean, 421A has been kind of the most talked about, but there's all sorts of others as well that are affordable housing and tax abatement programs. Are there other state level changes that you would advocate for? Any of those that I listed or anything else?
I mean, 421A should only be used in really rare exceptions in like outer borough areas where you need it. Most of the places that got it before it sort of sunset didn't need 421A. And as we were talking about property taxes, giving vast swaths of new construction a break, I don't think we need to do that. I think it's a waste of taxpayer money. And just thinking through some of the other pieces, I was very pleased to see that they extended the eviction moratorium. I mean, people need to be able to get back on their feet. The last thing we want to do is create a further homeless crisis in the middle of a pandemic, in the middle of winter. We want to keep people in their homes as much as possible, but we are also going to have to grapple with how are we going to deal with that ongoing debt that is accruing so that people aren't completely underwater when we're coming out of this. And I know there is some federal money, but clearly not enough.
Do you have any ideas how to do that? How to grapple with that?
I do think that it requires us to come to the table with landlords and with mortgage companies to do sort of workouts because, you'll even hear this with commercial retail is the mortgage says they can't lower the rent. So, there's a way to do this. I think that we need the financial services industry to actually be at the table and not sort of living behind us, having landlords and tenants fighting and not in the sort of the black hat is actually not even at the table. So that would be my thinking, but I am also very open to people thinking through with me how we begin to work that out, because I think it's going to be very challenging.
Okay, thank you. So we've got a little less than 10 minutes left. So I do want to remind folks to feel free to drop questions in the chat and hope to get to a few of them at the end. But I want to move now kind of to this, NYCHA inside and out, I'm sure both literally and figuratively. But there's this, for decades now, we've underfunded NYCHA, both in terms of capital needs and ongoing repairs. How would you approach closing that budget deficit for NYCHA, whether that's state advocacy, federal advocacy, city programs, all of the above?
Right. I'm in the all of the above category. I would definitely use as much of the RAD program as we can, based on what federal appropriations have been for those types of vouchers. And this is vouchers in the Section 8 world of vouchers, the transition. We can do about 62,000 units over the next few years. That leaves you another 100,000 plus units to do. I like Greg Russ's plan for a housing trust to generate capital on an ongoing basis, because those tenant protection vouchers are so much more lucrative than other vouchers. And I think it's very important for the city to move away from being funded by the federal government under the public housing section of the code, because no one else has it anymore. And you're going to have to get both Congress and Senate folks who don't have any public housing left because they've all moved to RAD to vote for money for New York City. I want to be where everybody has to vote for the same thing. And they've historically funded Section 8 and not funded public housing fully. But getting as much money into those two programs, I think, is incredibly important. And, I've been out and in people's apartments that have gone through conversion, and they are so proud of their apartments. They're excited to have people over if you were allowed to have family over at your house anymore, but to host Thanksgiving dinner, to host Christmas dinner. They literally will say, "You want to see my bathroom?" That's not usually part of the house tour, but they're very proud of where they live. And you want everyone who's in NYCHA to feel that way. And we have not spent enough money. And as I said, when I was the interim chair, we didn't put oil in the engine for 30 years and we're surprised it blew up. Why are we surprised that it blew up? But But we also should be doing infill where that's appropriate, or we should be doing build new on a piece of the campus, take down a building that really shouldn't be rehabbed, build a new building, take down a building, build a new building. So you're never moving people out of their home development. There's too much fear that they'll never go back, not only from what happened in New York City, but what happened across the country with public housing. So we need to make sure that you can see it, you move to it, you don't ever leave the grounds.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to take kind of a combination of a question that was just in the chat with one that we got actually submitted by someone who registered, which is with the knowledge that you hopefully will still be working with career folks in the administration, what is something that Mayor de Blasio and Deputy Mayor Vicky Bean, and I'd even extend this to other deputy mayors as well, but folks also in the administration, what is something that you think in retrospect they should have done differently? And, preferably on housing, but really anything that comes to mind.
Well, I mean, I think, if we start with NYCHA, nothing happened for a very long time. And not even the issue of lead, which is horrifying. But, nothing, they were not actually being managed and always have stood outside the family of agencies because obviously they're an authority. They are a little bit different. But, no one's sort of checking in and saying, how are we going to fix this? And I know Shola did a lot of work to make it so that their finances weren't as terrible as they had been, but the long-term plan that they put together, I don't think happened until 2018, maybe. That's too long. Like we needed a plan sooner than that. We needed to start working on RAD sooner than that. That would have been one place that I would have focused. On climate change as well. We had started to put together programs. Many of them got canceled. Climate change is not going away. It is still happening despite the pandemic. It takes long-term commitment, but we still are no better prepared for Hurricane Sandy than we were the day that happened.
Okay, so we've got just a couple minutes left. And again, I want to say thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us. Just a quick rapid fire. Feel free to elaborate, but yes or no is fine too. Would you support ending single family zoning in all of New York City?
Yes.
Would you support ending parking minimums in all of New York City?
Not necessarily.
Okay. All right.
There are some places in New York City where, as much as we would like to say there's a transit option, there's really not a transit option.
Would you support legalizing ADUs, accessory dwelling units, in every residential area of New York City?
Yes.
Would you create budget room? I mean, it's a little flexible, but the basement pilot program that was funded and then lost funding when COVID struck, would you create another citywide pilot like that?
I would, but I think we need a better template for what could possibly get approved. Because my sense of it was people were renting out their apartments. They weren't legal, but they didn't want to tell anybody because they were afraid if they told anyone, then they wouldn't be able to rent out their illegal apartment. That might actually be dangerous, but they were still making money off of it. So didn't want to change. So how do you protect them or even give a guide? Like if there's no egress, this is not going to fly. But one of the things that I find should be made easier is like, why do we have the height requirement? Every ceiling has to be, I don't know, some ridiculously, like, it doesn't make sense.
Yes. Okay. So that's largely a Department of Buildings question, I believe.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's 6:15. So I know you've got other appointments. So I just want to say on behalf of everyone who's been in the chat, who's been very much appreciating your knowledge, your insight into really the nuts and bolts of city government. Thank you so much for joining us, folks in the chat, folks who are tuning in, folks who may be on the recording. Thank you so much for joining us, for tuning in. Encourage you to check out, I think it's kgfornyc.com/housing is the platform that we've been discussing some of. And again, really, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today.
No, I'm thrilled to be here. I'm sorry I couldn't keep track of the chat and answer your questions at the same time. but I do appreciate everyone's commitment, and I think building more will go a long way for the city, and to be creative across. I think that that's what we need to do, and I think we can do it. There's this opening. If we can have open streets and open restaurants and less bureaucracy, look, we can actually do that. We can build things in less than 5, 6, 10, 12 years.
Well, fingers crossed. Well,
Fingers
thank you so
crossed.
much and have a good night, everybody.
Thank you.